Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you're joining from. Welcome back to Tata Literature Live. For everyone who's just tuned in, we are proud to present the 11th annual Mumbai International Lit Fest, completely digital for the first time ever, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects. There will be a 15-minute Q&A at the end of the session, so please do send in your questions in the comment section of the platform that you are viewing from. Ladies and gentlemen, some of the greatest literature of our time are works centered around sorrow, loss, and loneliness, the inevitable grind of tragedy. Why do we, time and again, find ourselves compelled by narratives of death, abuse, illness, and destruction? What power does darkness hold upon us? In this panel, we explore the bleakness of literary works and why they have over time become stories that we keep returning to. On the panel today, we have Andrei Kurkov, a Ukrainian novelist, journalist, and commentator. His work largely deals with everyday life in Ukraine after the fall of the USSR. He has authored over 20 novels, including the best-selling Death and the Penguin, which is a story of a young man who makes a living writing obituaries for a local news. We also have with us Markus Zusak, an Australian writer of German origin. He has written several books, including the international bestseller, The Book Thief, a story narrated by death and set in Nazi Germany during the Second World War. The Book Thief spent more than a decade on the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into more than 60 languages. Our final panelist for this session is Milena Moser. Though based in San Francisco, New Mexico, Milena is one of the most beloved and prolific Swiss-German writers. She has published over 20 countless short stories, articles, radio plays, and has even performed in the two-woman show, Die Unvollen. Chairing the session is Sonal Shah, a New Delhi-based writer who has been a part of editorial teams at The Caravan, Time Out Delhi, Vice India, among others. A very warm welcome to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, welcome everyone. I'm going to just start right in to this cheerful panel this morning in Delhi and elsewhere around the world where our panelists are. So I want to begin by just saying that, we're talking about darkness in literature today, but I think it's worth pointing out that while all the authors on this panel have written about very painful, heavy subjects, whether it's death, divorce, fascism, murder, abuse, all of these things, they've often done so with a very light touch or with a very different slant. So I think, there's a spectrum of writers out there, and between those who tackle very hard themes using very sort of straightforward language and very little pleasure in writing about these themes, to those who, do not touch them at all. But I think each of these authors has made a decision, whether conscious or unconscious, to kind of write about these themes in a very different way. So I want to ask all of you, each of you first, where do you see yourselves on this spectrum between talking about very dark subjects and then, talking about them in a different way or not talking about them at all? And when and how did you kind of decide on the kind of tone you would use to tackle things like death or fascism or repression? So if it was a conscious decision at all, when and how did you kind of come to your way of writing about it, about these things? So Milena, maybe we could start with you.
I'm definitely tackling those themes, but in a sort of hopeful or lighthearted way. It's something that I just accept the dark parts of life, and that's not a conscious decision. That's just who I am. Mm-hmm. And I thought when I met the other authors, somebody said, like, we're kind of a joyful bunch to talk about this this dark subject, but I think maybe we share that a little bit, that we are not dark personalities, and maybe that helps not being afraid of dark themes, of shadows, of the abyss, and being able to look at it and describe it, because, I don't know, I can't speak for you, of course, but for me it's definitely something that I'm not afraid to look at.
Mm. Andrei?
I'm quite happy to hear from Milena the words that we are not dark personalities, actually. I think it is right, but the background of this may be different because I grew up in the Soviet Union. I mean, I was trying to ignore the reality, which was not dark, it was more gray. But I started being published in the most dark years of the history at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And before that, actually, I experienced reading illegal or sort of blacklist books. Among them, one which shocked me, Archipelago Gulag by Solzhenitsyn. And this was actually a very depressive book about very depressive events. And I think somehow it actually remained in my head, but together with the understanding the effect it has on the reader. So when I wrote my first sort of black humor novel, I thought that actually life is depressive enough. If I write about things which are depressive, they will make people even more depressive. Then maybe I should add some black humor, because anyway, I mean, the only way to survive also your own death, is to laugh at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's really interesting. And Markus?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I've loved listening to both Andrei and Milena's stories because, I mean, I grew up in a place of light, and I still live here in Sydney. So we grew up playing football and cricket in the backyard in boiling hot sunshine. But because my parents were from Germany and Austria and growing up during the Second World War as children, we would, it was always funny. There was always a lot of humor, like friends of ours, because my mum and dad had strange accents. Both dark and light in them, and it's where they came together that I think the stories, really sort of exploded into view for me, that this is what humans are, both dark and light. And I think that's how I ended up writing that book the way I did.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I wanted to get a little bit more into what Milena was talking about, especially with your latest book, which I think the English title might be translated as The Beautiful Life of the Dead.
Yes,
if I can make a quick translation, of course it's in German. But in this book, you tackle your partner's mortality, very head on. So could you talk a bit about how both of you managed to write about and address this very difficult subject, and perhaps how a non-Eurocentric view of death also changed the way you would deal with it?
Yeah, this is something that was completely new to me when I met my now husband, Victor Mario, who's a Mexican indigenous artist and Nahua. And he comes from this tradition that just deals with death and dying and mourning very, very differently from... I grew up in Switzerland, which is also a great place, but very different, of course, than the former Soviet Union, and where death was not talked about. Switzerland, in general, is a place where you don't talk about anything. Also about the role Switzerland played in the Nazi regime, but that's a completely different subject. And so when I met him, I knew he was very sick, but he's actually doing pretty well now. The pandemic has been good for him, just staying inside. But he was the happiest man I ever met, and he never ever complains. He always jokes, and even when he goes in the hospital, he puts on some gown backward and he jokes with the nurses, and you would never ever think this man is very sick or in a lot of pain. And so I learned from him and from his tradition, and we just felt like actually the book grew from conversations with friends who said, well, can you tell us? It centers around the Dia de los Muertos, which just was 3 weeks ago, which is a beautiful tradition where you invite your the people you lost in your house, but you have to really, really court them, you have to cook for them, you have to tell stories about them, but not like we do in Switzerland, like, oh, he was a saint, but you kind of tease them and you say like, oh, I miss him so much, he still owes me money, and then you put tequila on the altar, and it's just a big, very lively affair, but it also means that you're not alone with your grief. So it's it made it easier for me to face all these things. My mother died just before 2 days before the Dia de los Muertos, and I was so grateful to have these tools, but they're completely a gift from this man I met at some point in my life.
Yeah.
I didn't grow up like that at all, whatsoever.
Yeah, and that has now informed the way you've written this book, I assume, and changed the way you would have. I mean, if you had to write a book about, say, death coming out of just a Swiss, your Swiss background, would it have been a very different book?
It would be very different. It would be a very sad and very short book. And there would be no joy in it at all. It would just be like, oh my God, you're going to die. But at least after you're dead, you'll be talked about like a saint. So
yeah. Be happy. So Andrei and Markus, you both use elements of the absurd or the surreal in your work, or a heightened sense of metaphor and possibility and fable. So could you both talk a little bit about, the literary traditions that you draw from here, and how sometimes what we think of as absurd or maybe hyperbolic and surreal allow you to tackle difficult issues in a different way? Markus, perhaps we could start with you.
Mm-hmm. Before I get onto that, I love Milena's discussion about, what she was talking about there, the very stiff, saintly version of people who have died, and I think this comes into what we're talking about, the humor of how we cope with the world too. And I often, my dad is 87 years old and I love him, but I do imagine his funeral sometimes, and I imagine, because I've been to funerals where everyone talks about this person as if they were a saint, and part of me kind of I don't look forward to my dad dying, but I look forward to sort of saying, he was actually a bit of a bastard. And there was that time when I was 9 years old at Christmas and he smashed my brand new alarm clock because he didn't know how to turn it off, and just because those stories are actually going to keep him alive, not saying, oh, he was the greatest guy, and everyone's sort of sitting there going, is this the same guy that we knew, growing up? But so I love that idea of what we're talking about. And but to the question about this tradition of the fable-like or the quirky, or hyperbolic idea, I have to admit I didn't really attempt that when I was writing The Book Thief, and I think it's the same, and I don't know how the other authors or other writers on the panel feel about this. I'm just trying to find something that works, because I'm constantly trying this and that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work. I'm constantly searching, and when I wrote The Book Thief, I started with death as the narrator and didn't work. And then I thought, now I'm going to try Liesl as the narrator. Didn't work. Then I tried just third person. Didn't work. And I came back to death as a narrator, and the first time it didn't work, it was because death was like the Swiss death. But even nastier, he was like much more stiff, but also he was enjoying his work in a very macabre sort of way. And I would write a page and I would feel like I had to go and take a shower or something. He was just enjoying the whole aspect of the darkness so much. And it was when I lightened his voice that I started to think, oh, this is actually becoming interesting now. And now I'm interested in writing the book. So for me, one of my favorite, a friend of mine who's also a writer said, don't worry about all the rules of show, don't tell, and all of this. Don't worry about these rules. It's whatever's going to work, and that's just what worked for me, was that kind of heightened voice. And the last thing I'll say about it is, when people come up to me because of the voice of death and they say, "Oh, I read your book and I feel so much better now about dying," and I say to them, I'm really happy for you because I'm not looking forward to dying that much still, So it's quite funny that we can have that we still can laugh about,
I'm wondering, which nationality of death would I prefer to take me away? Yeah, that's really interesting that people say that. Andrei, what about you? I know you've spoken in the past about how you found it difficult to write, about some of your experiences. For example, you were a prison guard in Odessa when you were young, and other things you've witnessed, but you didn't really feel like you could write about them in a realistic way because you couldn't write about them in using that absurd tone that you actually do use in your books. So maybe you could talk a bit about that literary tradition for you and, how that works.
Well, I come probably from a literary tradition of Bulgakov, Gogol, and Kafka, and I'm thinking now that it was very strange that Franz Kafka was published in the Soviet Union, and he was writing about the Soviet Union without knowing about it. I remember now one episode from 1982. That we had 6 general secretaries of the Communist Party as leaders of the Soviet Union, and in 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died. He was very old and frail at that time. He was a hero of lots of jokes and anecdotes, but he died, and I was a student in the Foreign Languages College. And I mean, this was time when we had a huge sort of activities hall in the college, but no screen and no projectors. So the organizers, the administration, put the biggest Soviet TV set on the stage, on the huge stage, and invited 700 students to watch funeral of Leonid Brezhnev in Moscow. And what I remember, I was surprised because, this mass of students with a tiny TV set, and you don't see what is happening there, but you know what is happening there. And then suddenly you start crying. And the whole, this activity hall started crying. It was like an impulse from George Orwell that it is time to cry. You know this from North Korean television, that if you don't cry enough, you will be imprisoned. But we were not managed to be imprisoned, but still, there was something natural and not natural about this. So I think my attitude towards death was also shaped by some strange semi-physiological things which are happening to the whole nation. When somebody dies without whom you don't see the future, at the same time you laugh at him, you hate him, and you are happy at the same time that he is dead, but you are sure that there will be somebody else who will replace him, and he will die the same way, and there will be the same color TV on the stage.
This reminds me of Bulgakov's, stage in Master and Margarita, where all these crazy things are happening and people are just having to react without,
But what me makes happy now that actually we don't need TV sets now on the stage. You can have everything on screen, but that became much smaller, much less important. So the death lost its role. So it is not stop of the world anymore.
Right. Interesting. So when you sort of started writing, was there a point when you just always felt like this absurdity, like having a penguin as like a primary character in your novel? It just came naturally to you in that sense.
I think actually in the Soviet time I was looking for. I started writing prose by inventing jokes because me and my elder brother, we took part several times in illegal joke-telling competition on the Crimea, which is now annexed by Russia. And it was always August, and there was a company from different cities of the Soviet Union, and in the night we were burning fires, sort of frying mussels, drinking white wine, and telling jokes and marking who told how many jokes, and the rule was not to repeat the jokes. And so in order to win the case of champagne, Soviet champagne, I was inventing jokes, and once we actually won with my brother, And to invent jokes, you are looking around. You are looking for some strange things which can resonate in intellectuals' minds. So, I mean, this habit probably still remains in me. When I come to an unknown place, unknown country, first of all, I'm looking for absurdity and strange things which will make me laugh.
That's fascinating. And I mean, they say, you know, the best parties are under very repressive regimes, but this sounds like it tops everything, eating mussels and telling jokes in Crimea. That's incredible. So Milena, you've written both nonfiction and fiction, and so many examples of each. But could you talk a bit about how do you tackle these heavy subjects differently, or just the way when you come to writing a book, is there a different treatment for fiction or nonfiction, or have both kind of informed each other for you?
It's very different. It's nonfiction to me is always. I was actually thinking about how do I do it when Markus was talking, because I don't think about it so much. Fiction for me is like it's like hearing voices in my head and then at some point realizing, oh, that's not my thought, that's someone else. And then I kind of find a character in my head, and I just, once I see that character or I feel that character, I just follow him or her. And that's a big adventure. And writing nonfiction, especially if it's kind of memoir-like things, it's in a way the adventure is not there because I already know what happened. So it's more about figuring out, can it be useful for somebody else? So it's much less fun than writing fiction. I have, now that I think of it, I have I hope that doesn't make you think badly of me, but at some point in my life I had I was in therapy and I did a psychiatric evaluation with a multiple choice question, and it was like a 5-page evaluation, and one question was, do you sometimes hear voices that nobody else can hear? You know, always, often, sometimes. And so I said, like, yeah, very often. And apparently that's a red flag question. So immediately they called me and said, what kind of... The funny thing is I was still living in Switzerland at that time, and the woman said, what are those voices you hear, Frau Moser? Is it the Mossad? And I was like... But apparently that's a common hallucination that Swiss people have. They hear the Mossad. They said, no, it's my characters. And they said, oh, then you're fine. So that made me realize, like, if you're a writer, you can get away with pretty much everything. But it really is like that. I hear a voice and I kind of follow it, and it's a process I have very little control over. Whereas memoir writing, I make very conscious decisions. Okay, this is not interesting for other people, and this might be interesting for other people, or this might be helpful.
I think it's harder to write about, personally, about difficult things that have happened to yourself versus making a character go through it. No. I
don't care about myself so much. People sometimes say, like, well, you give, it's like, I don't know how you say it in English, you give away too much of yourself. Right. You share too much. And I feel like, well, but I'm not made of gold. I mean, what, it's, if I have something that can be useful, why not share it? I mean, it's not like I'm special or anything. It's not like, but that's also a Swiss thing, like, don't anybody see that maybe you're not perfect or not. So a good Swiss person would never talk about doing a psychiatric evaluation.
Andrei, you've also written a book called Ukrainian Diaries, and you've written journalism. So for you, is there a difference in terms of when you come to writing, fiction versus just reporting or news or nonfiction?
It is a big difference, actually, and I prefer fiction because, fiction is directed by yourself. Here, reporting or telling what is really happening makes you much more responsible, and actually you have to be not only truthful, but you have to give sort of your judgment, which will be taken differently from your prose.
Right.
So giving judgment to real events makes you political, shows your side, even if you are trying to be objective. 100%. In fiction, actually, you control everything, and you are relaxed. I mean, you are relaxed and you are playful. I mean, sometimes I think actually I write a story in order to find out what happens in this story, not because I know this story already.
Right, right. That's interesting. I mean, I've seen. I wouldn't exactly call it a trend, but I think a lot of books that are very, awarded and rewarded and critically acclaimed tend to be books. Especially recently, I have sort of seen a lot of novels that almost resemble news reports, or very, very close to the way someone might actually write in long form about a news event. I don't know if that's something you've come across at all. I don't want to take any specific examples, but you might have an idea in mind what I'm talking about.
Are you directing this to me?
Yeah, I mean, to any of you, actually.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first word which comes to me in mind is reportage. I mean, when you describe your own adventure, then you have a control or to add something fictional to this or not.
Right.
But this is the ideal hybrid of reality and author's touch.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able probably to write completely documentary novel based on real events. I am dealing now with history, for example, of 1919 in Kiev, and I got as a present lots of archives, and I could use these archives just to retell the story, to reconstruct. But I'm deforming, reshaping it, adding lots of things, and trying to find sources which will prove that I have a right to do this.
Right.
I think it can be painful for a writer to try to censor his imagination while working on the real events story.
Okay. So Markus, I wanted to ask you a bit about your most recent book, Bridge of Clay. And in it, you've spoken elsewhere about failure being this great motivator. But I wanted, in this book, you have a bunch of brothers who are kind of failing up almost rather than growing up. So I wanted to ask you, a bit about what the book means to you and whether the way you've looked at these dark themes, say the death of a parent, which happens in this book, as well as in The Book Thief, has that evolved? I mean, the way you would address these things, and how?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm still. I can't tell you how much I'm loving hearing the other authors speak, and every time they're saying something, I'm going, oh yeah, there's,
So jump in if you feel like.
I love that idea of hearing voices, and also what Andrei was talking about. Just the playfulness. What I'm always looking for is play, and I often describe writing a novel to people. I mean, there are all these ways that we can describe it, and it depends which one I want to reach for. But I sometimes say to people, it's like climbing a mountain, but there's the promise of a sand pit or a sandbox at the top that you get to play in. And the example of that I often give is Michael Chabon's book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, where there's an image. There's somewhere in the middle of the book where it describes a big ocean liner coming into New York Harbor, and it says, the Rotterdam came into New York Harbor like a mountain wearing a dinner jacket. And I read that and I think, that's a writer who's climbed the mountain and is sitting in the sand pit playing. Just play, because I don't think you wake up in the morning and write that sentence. You're sitting, so it's true that all your best ideas come to you, I think, while you're sitting at your desk, and all the opportunities come to you then. And so I loved what both Milena and Andrei were talking about with that kind of playfulness and listening to the other truths that you're being told, and that are next to everything else. And so I think that's what I'm always trying to do, and that includes writing Bridge of Clay, where, it's these 5 brothers in this lawless house, and there's a lot of grief in that book, but there's also a lot of laughter, and those boys fight each other in a way that proves their love, and but they're always laughing with each other too. And I think with that book I just wanted to take bigger risks and bigger challenges, and every time I had a choice, do I make this harder or a bit easier, I would take the harder choice. And 13 years later, the book was finished, and I thought, I'm never doing that again. But I think we all have to have one book that breaks us, and that was the book that broke me. And I think, I wasn't the same person at the end of it as I was at the beginning of it. In terms of even the fact that I started it, I didn't have any children, and now, it took, when I finished it, my daughter was 12 years old, and my son was 8. So, so I love this idea that we live these lives, but as writers, I get to live more than that life. I live in 2 worlds. I live in this world, but I live in the world of the book I'm writing, which is just, and I want to be able to roll out of bed and land in that world. Because the further away that world is, the least happy I am. I want to have a foot in both all of the time.
That's really interesting. I mean, we're talking about why we write about darkness, but sometimes a book can actually break you, as you said. Sometimes perhaps writing can be the source of the darkness as well as the light.
Very
I
true.
You, either of you, Andrei or Milena, have a book that you would point to as something that kind of, like, either was a lot more challenging than you had expected or brought a certain kind of darkness to your life that you hadn't expected?
Well, Milena first.
Perfectly all right.
Actually, the book I just kind of finished, but I'm still kind of working on the editing. It kind of broke me, but in a good way, because I tried something that I never tried before, something like parallel lives and parallel realities, and I always wanted to do that, but I never had the mental space for it. I had so my kids are more than grown up now, and so the kids are grown up, and I was alone for a while, and I left Switzerland, and all these obligations I had, readings and theater and radio and all that stuff behind, and then suddenly I was able to do these things that I always thought, like, well, maybe I'll try that once, but it turned out to be so difficult that I got so confused. At first I wanted, also kind of inspired by Victor's tradition, that the Toltecs believe that you live 13 lives at the same time. So that was where I started, with 13 parallel lives. I quickly reduced them to 2, but I still got confused. And again I felt like maybe I lost it, or maybe my writing broke. Maybe I can't write anymore. And after I've been writing since I was a kid, and I've been published for 30 years now, and in a way it was really good to go back to the beginning. I mean, the Buddhists have that concept of the beginner's mind, and I really felt that, and I hated it while it happened, but at the same time I knew, this is good, Milena, this is good. Yeah. Because it broke me, but it's like I started over as a writer. So yeah,
a new mountain to climb, huh? Yeah.
Well, as to me, I don't think I had a book like this. I mean, I had difficult books to write. I mean, it took me 9 years to write one huge novel with 4.5 plot lines and about 100 characters, and I almost went crazy because I was forgetting the biographies and connections, so I was making lots of notes, and they were on the floor. And actually, it took me 7 years to write and 2 years to abridge, because I wrote 2,500 pages. And when I gave it to my publisher, he said, well, this is a trilogy, so I'll publish it in 3 volumes. Okay, it is published now in 3 volumes, but it was a competition. It was not like the book was trying to break me. I created this situation. But I think also because of my nature, I would say light-hearted nature, probably I avoided purposely trying to write a book that can break me. Maybe
Right.
I will write it later.
Right. I like this idea of a sandbox and play. I wanted to actually ask you, well, Milena and Andrei both, but also Markus, about the language that you write in. So Milena, you write in German, and Andrei, you write in Russian. And I wanted to talk a little bit. Do you feel like your native language, your writing language, does that allow you to kind of talk about things in a slightly more humorous way, or use dark humor in a way that perhaps English doesn't? And also, Markus, how do you use, especially in your latest book, very poetic, sometimes a lot of metaphors and so on. So how do you kind of tweak English and use it differently? So maybe, Milena, you could talk about writing in German a little bit first.
Well, German is definitely not a language that, contains a lot of humor. It's not an elegant language. It's, for a German Swiss writer, it's already the second language. So we grow up speaking a dialect that now more and more writers write also. But when I started, it was completely unthinkable to write in dialect. So the High German, as we call it, the real German, is already kind of a second language. And I think in a way, it helps it creates that first thin layer of distance. So even when I write about myself, it's not my thought, because my thought is, even after all these years in America, my thought is still Swiss dialect, but I write in High German. So there's already a layer of distance. And I don't know if I'll ever start writing in English. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Andrei, what about writing in Russian?
Well, I mean, it's my mother tongue, of course, so it's much easier for me to experiment. I always loved experimenting with words, with structures, with syntaxes. And although I wrote a couple of books in Ukrainian, non-fiction and children's books, because my command of Ukrainian is less serious than in Russian. But I mean, Russian is a tougher language than Ukrainian. In Ukrainian, you can have much more diminutive suffixes, for example, than in Russian. And even there is a diminutive suffixes for a word which means enemy. So it's like, if you translate into English, it will be my little lovely enemy. But you cannot say this in Russian. But for me, it is, of course, natural to write in my mother tongue. I try to write in English also. I started writing many years ago poetry in English, and at that time I was writing poetry, also poems in Russian. And I noticed that all my poems in English were incredibly depressive, dark, and about death. And all my actually poems in Russian were funny and about life. Right. So I stopped writing in English.
So maybe, do you think English is just a slightly more depressing language?
I'm not sure, but it's very economical language, I would say. And I noticed that actually my translations into English, like sort of 10% shorter, 15% shorter than the original.
Okay.
Of course, I mean, the English words, many words are very short comparing to Russian long words, etc. But I mean, it happens to the languages. I think maybe you can call it efficiency of the language, which is then transposed into efficiency of the nation and system. Then it would explain lots of things.
Yeah, for sure. Markus, I think, you write in English, but you do use language in a very different way.
Yeah, it's funny listening. So many things have jumped up to say. The first thing, I think Milena will appreciate this, is my dad, I love talking about my dad in these situations for some reason. Maybe that's my therapy. But when The Book Thief came out in German, he read the English version and the German edition side by side. And he said to me afterwards, and these were his exact words, he said, you know, it's not so much that your book is shit in English. It's just that it's so much better in German.
Oh.
You know, to which I said, "Oh, that's great, thanks, Dad. You know, the German translator is a much better writer than I am, and she is a fantastic translator." But no, I think I want to talk a little bit about language in slightly that left of centre way, where to me there's that other language that every book has, and I think it's really come through the conversation. Is there's the language of what the book just feels like. And I know when I wrote The Book Thief, it was like scratching something open in my mind, and forget about German, forget about English, forget everything. But because of the stories my mum and dad had told me, which were the foundation of that book, it was like I reached in and I pulled that world out and I wrote it. And it was like, it's this other language, you know, which is, I guess I can only describe as, this is how that world feels. This is how that book feels. And as long as and I think I'm using English to create that language, you know, and so that's why I don't have a great intellect. I don't have a great vocabulary, but with the pool of words that I have, I'm trying so many different combinations. I'm putting words next to each other that are creating, hopefully, what I say to people is, you're not trying to write a better book than anyone or to prove you're a better writer or anything like that. You're trying to write the book that only you could have written. And I think that's the language I'm looking for when I sit down to write. But it takes a while.
Yeah. And you have these very startling images that, you know, using words that you normally don't see next to each other kind of bring up. And sometimes they don't make sense, but they do convey a very specific feeling. So I think that's really interesting. And I also think it's something, you know, a lot of your books are billed as sort of young adult books. Andrei, you've also written children's books. And I wonder if you feel that that is in a way sort of liberating and in a way easier to talk about some of the hard things in life in a way that appeals to a broad audience and an audience that doesn't come to it with necessarily preconceived notions of what a book should look like.
Well, actually, I treat writing children's books as a therapy after writing a novel.
Uh-huh.
So I mean, for me, it's like taking a hot bath and relaxing, because I mean, you cannot put politics into children's books. You cannot put real evil. Everything is sort of pretending to be evil in children's stories. And then children are much more open to absurdities. They are looking for something to laugh at, to play with. And in this sense, actually, it's a pleasure also to write books for children. Especially when the time is different and now you don't need to put moral imperative in each story or anything from pedagogical science. So you are just like entertaining the children, and they are very grateful usually. They are not demanding so much, because I mean, the adults, they can come back to you and accuse you of being not enough entertainful.
Yeah, and I think you still write about pretty dark things in your children's books. So it's, yeah.
Well, not in all of them. I mean, but because I mean, my latest two children's books are for the very small children who cannot read. So I mean, they are to be read by parents, and it's about a hedgehog, which is very sad because nobody caresses him.
I mean, that sounds like it's about alienation. We have to move on to the questions from the audience now. So let's see if we have any questions yet.
Or any of our authors would like to elaborate on that. How does one introduce dark themes to young readers? The question is from Arun G.
Maybe Markus, you could talk about this a bit, since we've just heard from Andrei kind of on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you went to the right person there. I'm not sure I have an answer for that, because, and I think always in these situations it's really important to be honest, because my answer to that question is I actually don't know. And and I think I don't necessarily see that, I never see these responsibilities as part of my job. I think, to me, you know, my job is to get the book right. And if I'm getting the book right, those introductions will be made naturally or by someone who's better suited to the job than me. And so I wasn't sitting there writing The Book Thief going, how do I introduce young people? Because I honestly thought no one was going to read that book. I didn't know if it, I thought it would be my least successful book, which is how I wrote it in the way that I did. So actually my answer to the question is probably don't even try.
Yeah.
Do the right thing by your book, do the right thing by your characters, and they will make those introductions for you. That's the best way I can say it, and I'm sure one of the other authors probably got something more wise to say than that, hopefully.
Don't expect more wise things to be told. I think it is important in this sense to understand the background of these young readers, because, for example, in the post-Soviet society, horror films and horror books didn't work because there was too much horror in the real history. So, I mean, if you are talking about kids or young adults from a happy country, then at the same time it will be easy to introduce, or I mean, it will be easy for them to read about dark things, but they will not take them seriously if these dark things are coming from the country with a more dark background.
Right.
Because, I mean, everybody compares what happens to the characters in the book with his own background, his own life.
Context is also important. I think that's a good point.
Thank you. Milena, would you like to add to that?
I've never really, I'm more like Markus. I don't think about who is going to read the book, and so I can't really answer that definitely not in a wiser way than Markus and Andrei already did.
All right, thank you. Our next question is from Usha Subramanian. Kafka said, and I quote, "A good book should wake us up with a blow to the head, not to make us happy. We would be happy precisely if we had no books." What are your views about that?
Well, since I'm named after Kafka's miserable lover, Milena Moser, I always feel like I can talk back to Kafka. It's like, I read your letters. So Kafka, I don't agree at all. We would not be happy without books. Books should not, I think sometimes books hit you over the head, and that's good, but by no means that's all they do or that's what they have to do. And especially since we were talking about young readers before, for me, I had in a very safe, beautiful country, a very miserable childhood, and books were my best friends and my escape, and books were so important to me. Books saved my life, if you want to be dramatic. So I don't think books they have to educate us or hit us over the head or wake us up. That can be a side effect. But books are much more than that. Much, much more. Sorry, Kafka. Again.
I'm sure he'll understand.
Centuries later, she's talking back to Kafka. I love it.
Andrei, Markus, would any of you like to weigh in?
We shouldn't forget that actually Franz Kafka was masochist, and actually he was made masochist by the system in which he lived. Absolutely. So, I mean, an unhappy writer cannot give happy advice.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would say is that, yeah, the blow to the head, I mean, it's such a startling image. But I love the idea that, yeah, a book can be great for having done that, but another book can be equally great for picking you up after that blow. And both Milena and Andrei have talked about various books of their own. I mean, the hot bath analogy. One book might be an ice bath, and the next one's the warm bath to bring you back. So I'm glad there isn't a little window with Kafka, on screen here. It's come to tell us all off. Luckily.
Thank you. Shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
This is from Archana Jagirdar. Someone once said the best poetry comes through pain. Is that true for novels too?
No, don't believe it. Short novels come through pain sometimes, but once you are sort of absorbed by the novel and it is becoming bigger than you, I mean, you don't feel pain. You might feel sort of you lost control of the novel and it became more important than you thought, and then you wrote it. Yes, but this is a different case, of course. Yeah.
What about you? I mean,
I think Markus' novel came through pain. Yeah.
One of them. I mean, I can say something that yeah, I agree with that with Andrei, and in that there can be pain. I think there's a little bit of pain in every pursuit that you're trying to do with excellence, and you're trying to write a beautiful novel or a comedic novel or whatever you're trying to do. But I think writing's what makes me most alive. Similar to what Milena said about how she felt about books growing up, is the thing that made me want to be a writer was reading novels and knowing that they weren't true, but believing them when I was inside them, reading them. And to me, that's this magic, So I don't think it's pain that creates novels. I think, and I know this sounds, I'll temper it a little bit by saying it's not necessarily magic, but it's a magical act that you're trying to pull off, to believe something that isn't, not only to believe something that isn't true, but to make the unreal real. And I think that more than pain makes a novel, and I think that's a beautiful process, or that's what makes poetry or something poetic in a novel as well.
Maybe I misunderstood the question and thought I interpreted it as you have to know pain in order to write a novel, not necessarily be in pain while you write the novel. And I definitely think that the more you experienced as a person, the more the better you can write. If you know kind of a bigger spectrum of emotions or life experiences or whatnot. But maybe I misunderstood the question completely.
I think you understood it perfectly, and I misunderstood it.
It's perception.
Perception. We'll ask Kafka.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next question. This is from Satish D'Souza. Why is tragedy considered high art and comedy considered low? Is catharsis more important than levity?
No.
no.
I think it's a very classical approach, which is slightly old-fashioned, because, I mean, there is no hierarchy of genre anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, tragic comedy is considered sometimes higher than tragedy, which means that actually comedy can be higher than tragedy, more important. Because actually tragedy really can make you depressed, and comedy, which is making serious things laughable, actually can instruct you what to do or how to perceive difficult situations in life.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's a distinction that doesn't really have as much meaning as people sometimes make it out to have, perhaps. So.
Absolutely. Milena, Marcus, would you like to add to that before we move on to the next question?
I don't think I have anything to add. I know this distinction more from in German critics often distinguish between real literature and literature that entertains, and that's something I struggled with all my life because I don't understand what is wrong with entertaining you read. I don't think we can.
Sorry, I think there's a bit of a sound disturbance.
Yeah. But I think actually comparing dramas and comedies is like comparing white bread with dark bread, or rice dosa with some kind of dark dosas. I mean, it doesn't make sense, but it has actually, they have distinctions, that's all.
Yeah.
They are different.
Yeah. So which dosa do you prefer, Andrei?
White, with masala, with vegetable masala, please.
Ooh, the best.
Yes.
Getting hungry.
Yeah. For me, it's breakfast time coming.
Yeah.
Okay, so you will have breakfast and we'll have lunch in India, and I think you'll have dinner.
It's a nice gap.
All right. Our next question is from Mehul. Did the themes ever affect you in such a way that you didn't want to write anymore?
Themes?
The themes that you write about, the dark themes, did it ever affect you in such a way that you didn't want to write anymore?
No, not in my case.
I had one book I was writing about the sexual abuse of a child, and I found it very hard to. I kind of circled around the scene, and in the end, I kept it in the book because I felt like the reader is as reluctant as I was as the writer to really go there, and so I kind of circled it and then just touched it very quickly and turned away again because I just couldn't go there. I just couldn't describe it either, but I also didn't think it was necessary. But that was the one time where I felt like I don't want to go there. I know I have to. I don't want to go there. I know I have to. So, but it wouldn't have made me stop at all. That never happens. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that in general, I, you know, if something like people would say to me, oh, when you wrote the end of, say, The Book Thief or whatever, and they'll say, oh God, how did you do that? That must have been so harrowing, and how did you, and I just say, I know it was, but I loved every second of it, you know, and I was sitting there and I was just, you know, basically bawling as I wrote, but that's how I wanted to feel, because and that's how I kind of knew that I was doing the right thing. And so I think I want to ride every emotion that's in the book, whether it's a comedic moment or the most tragic moment. But I think what Milena's talking about there is also a very different thing, where I'm talking about the outside world in a way coming, you know, to get these people and what happens, whereas something that you're taking on a totally different responsibility. And so, but for me, yeah, I tend to want to feel everything, and so I'm happy to be there.
That's beautiful, Marcus. We have time for just one last question. Where do you draw the line between what you can and cannot include in dark themes?
No line.
I think it's intuition. I mean, you stop yourself when you are approaching this line without realizing that there is a line.
Yeah, I agree. I think that was my best answer.
Not close enough.
Sorry, Sonal, we didn't get that.
I think if you're conscious of a line, then you're not close enough to it. You know, if you're not convinced of it, maybe it's okay. Yeah.
So it's almost like you go with your gut feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
That's what your editor's for, to tell you when you've crossed it.
Yeah.
So we all need, or not we, I mean, you need a wonderful editor.
We all do.
Yeah. As an editor, I agree. But yeah.
All right, I think that's all for the question and answer round. Sonal, if you would like to sum up any last thoughts before we end our conversation.
No, I think this has been a really interesting panel, and when I heard of the subject matter, I thought it's going to be extremely gloomy and extremely depressing, especially at a time like this when we're all kind of sitting in our, beautifully book-bedecked living room, but still so far apart. But I think that's really the power of literature and books and all of your work that you've done, is to actually bring people together to talk about these difficult things. So thank you very much for your work and for being here. And thank you, Jillian, for fielding these questions as well from the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for this very engaging conversation. It's been fantastic having you here. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come again.
Absolutely.
In person.
In person.
It's been a fantastic time having all our speakers at Tata Lit Live. A big thank you to our title sponsor Tata, and to you, our audience, for being here today and actively participating in the conversation by sending in all your wonderful questions. Coming up at 1:30 p.m. IST is Homo Digitalis, a peek into the world of artificial intelligence with Toby Walsh and Madan Mohan Rao. See you there.